Jalen came to his father's grave to say goodbye, but what he heard changed everything. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. The cemetery stretched out in silence, a field of gray stones standing like solemn witnesses to the passage of time. A gentle wind rustled through the trees, making the dry golden leaves shudder and fall, tumbling across the well-worn paths. Jalen stood still in front of a newly placed headstone. His small fingers curled tightly around a delicate white flower. The cold breeze tugged at his oversized jacket, one that had belonged to his father. The sleeves extended far past his wrists, but Jalen didn't mind. He wanted to keep wearing it, even though his mother had told him it was too big. It still smelled faintly like his father, like soap, leather, and something warm and comforting that Jalen couldn't quite describe. He stared at the name carved into the smooth stone, Marcus Bennett, with the words, "Beloved Father and Son," taken too soon, etched below. Jalen didn't understand how a few letters on a slab of rock could represent everything his father had been. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't fair. He swallowed hard, his throat tight and chest aching with an unfamiliar weight. It had been 6 months, but the pain hadn't faded. It stayed with him like a shadow creeping into every moment of his life. The house felt different. His mother was different. Everything was different. Jalen had thought that maybe, just maybe, if he came here, he would feel something change. But all he felt was emptiness. He crouched down, placing the flower gently on the cold earth, his hands trembling. He pressed them into his lap, trying to steady himself. He didn't want to cry, not here, not now. He had promised himself he would be strong. His father had always said, "Real strength isn't about not feeling, Jalen. It's about facing the things that scare you." But how could he face this? Jalen remembered his father's laugh, deep and rich, like a song. He remembered the way his father would lift him onto his shoulders, making him feel like he could touch the sky. He remembered the nights they sat on the porch, looking at the stars, his father pointing out constellations, while telling stories that Jalen was sure no one else in the world had ever heard. Now, there was only silence. His finger curled into the damp grass as he fought against the tears burning in his eyes. He hadn't spoken out loud since he arrived. He didn't know what to say. "Why did you leave?" The words barely made a sound, a whisper swallowed by the wind. His father had always been there. He was supposed to always be there, but he wasn't, and the world had not stopped for him. Jalen had begun to notice things that had never made sense before. The way adults whispered when they thought he wasn't listening, the way his mother's voice had changed, quieter, heavier, edged with something he didn't understand, the way people looked at him differently at school. Everything was different. Teachers were less patient. Their smiles were forced. His classmates still talked to him, but there was a distance now, an unspoken wall between them. One day, he had heard one of the boys in his class whispering when he thought Jalen wasn't around. "It's sad, but my dad says it happens all the time." Another voice added, "Yeah, my mom says it's better not to get too close. You never know." Jalen hadn't understood, but then he had. He had never really thought about his skin before. His father had told him he was beautiful, that he came from strong people. He had said their history was something to be proud of, but now Jalen didn't feel strong. He felt small. He clenched his jaw, staring at the name on the stone, searching for something, anything, that would make this hurt less. But nothing came. The wind stirred around him, making the leaves dance, and he pulled his father's jacket tighter around his body.
He closed his eyes, and for the first time since the funeral, he let himself cry. Jalen didn't know how long he sat there in front of the gravestone, knees pressed into the damp earth, his father's too-large jacket wrapped tightly around him as though it could somehow protect him from the hollow ache inside his chest. The world around him felt distant, muffled, like he was trapped inside a bubble that separated him from everything else. He could hear the wind moving through the trees, the faint rustling of leaves skittering across the ground. But it all sounded far away, as if he were underwater. The only thing that felt real was the weight in his chest, the impossible heaviness that he had been carrying for months. He had thought, hoped, that coming here would make things better, that standing before his father's name carved in stone would give him a sense of connection, of closeness. But all he felt was emptiness. His father was gone, and nothing would bring him back.
Jalen lifted his hand and wiped at his face with the sleeve of the jacket, angry at himself for crying. He hated crying. His father had never told him that boys shouldn't cry. He had, in fact, said the opposite. Your feelings don't make you weak, Jay. They make you human. It takes strength to feel things. But it didn't feel like strength now. It just felt like pain. The wind picked up suddenly, curling around him in a way that made him shiver. It wasn't the cold that made him react. It was something else, something he couldn't explain. It was as if the wind had hands, as if it were reaching for him, wrapping around him like an embrace. He tensed, blinking rapidly as a strange warmth spread through his chest. It didn't make sense. The wind wasn't warm. It was autumn, and the air had been cool all day, but this was different. Then, just as he was about to shake it off, he heard it. A voice. His body went rigid, every muscle locking into place. His breath hitched in his throat, and his heart hammered so hard he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. Jalen. It was soft, like a whisper carried on the breeze, but it was unmistakable. He knew that voice. He knew it better than any sound in the world. His fingers dug into the fabric of his father's jacket as he turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the empty cemetery, looking for, he didn't even know what, a figure, a trick of the light, someone hiding behind the trees. But there was no one. Only the rows of gray stones, the shifting leaves, and the fading daylight. His pulse pounded in his ears. Had he imagined it? Was it just the wind? He swallowed hard, shaking his head, willing himself to think logically. Maybe he was just exhausted. Maybe he'd been sitting here too long, letting his thoughts get tangled up with his memories. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But then he heard it again. Jalen. This time it was even softer. But there was something unmistakably familiar about it. Warm, reassuring, like a blanket wrapped around his shoulders on a cold night. Like his father. Jalen's breath came in shallow gasps. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Dad? His own voice barely made a sound, just a whisper in the wind. But the moment he said it, the strange warmth in his chest deepened, spreading through him like sunlight breaking through clouds. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But it felt real. He squeezed his eyes shut, his heart racing. He wanted to believe it. He wanted it so badly that it hurt. For months, he had felt nothing but emptiness, nothing but the crushing silence left behind in his father's absence. He had prayed, though he wasn't sure who he was praying to hear his father's voice one more time, to feel him, to know he wasn't completely gone. And now, here, with the wind curling around him and the warmth settling in his chest, it felt like like maybe he wasn't. "I'm here, buddy." The words came so clearly this time that Jalen's eyes snapped open. He turned his head sharply, expecting to see him, his father, standing there, smiling down at him the way he always did. But there was nothing. Just the empty space between the graves, the darkening sky above, and the wind whispering through the trees. His stomach twisted. Was he losing his mind? But even as panic crawled up his throat, he realized something. He wasn't afraid. The voice wasn't loud or frightening. It didn't send chills down his spine or make the hairs on the back of his neck rise. If anything, it did the opposite. It made him feel safe. Jalen squeezed his fingers into the fabric of the jacket, pressing his lips together as a fresh wave of emotion swelled inside him. He wanted to say something, to ask something, but the words wouldn't come. "I never left," the voice said. Jalen's breath hitched. The wind stirred again, softer this time, like a hand brushing against his cheek. His father had done that sometimes when Jalen had been upset as a little kid. Just a light touch, a reminder that he was there. "I miss you," Jalen whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do without you." The air around him stilled just for a moment. Then gently the voice returned. "You're braver than you think." Jalen swallowed hard, blinking against the fresh wave of tears that threatened to fall. He wanted to ask so many things, where his father was, if this was real, why the world felt so cruel without him. But somehow he knew there were no answers that would make any of it easier. He took a slow, shaky breath, staring at the gravestone again. Was it real, or was it just his mind trying to hold on to something, trying to fill the silence with the only voice he had ever truly trusted? Maybe it didn't matter, because for the first time in 6 months, the ache in his chest felt just a little bit lighter. He wasn't ready to say goodbye, but maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to. Not really. Jalen sat there for a while longer, letting the warmth linger, letting the words settle deep inside him. He didn't know if he would ever hear them again. He didn't know if this moment would fade, if it would feel like a dream when he woke up tomorrow. But as he stood up, brushing the dirt from his jeans, he realized something. He didn't feel alone anymore. Jalen walked home slowly, his mind still wrapped around the voice he had heard at the cemetery. His sneakers scuffed against the cracked sidewalk as he dragged his feet, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't sure how to explain it. Was he losing his mind? Would anyone believe him? Would his mother just look at him with tired eyes and nod, pretending to understand the way she always did? Now, the sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the houses lining the block. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had: brick buildings, chain-link fences, patches of grass struggling to grow in front yards. A couple of kids were playing basketball a few houses down, their laughter carrying through the cool evening air. The sound should have made Jalen feel normal. It didn't. His hands stayed buried in the sleeves of his father's jacket as he turned up the front steps of his house. The porch light was already on, even though the sky wasn't fully dark yet. His mother always turned it on early now, as if she were afraid of the night creeping in too soon. When he pushed open the door, the familiar scent of home wrapped around him, warm spices and whatever his mother was cooking, the faintest trace of lavender from the candle she kept burning in the living room. The house was quiet, except for the sound of water running in the kitchen. He followed the noise, stepping inside to find his mother at the sink, rinsing off a cutting board. She looked up when she heard him. "Hey, baby," she said softly. Her voice had changed since his father died. It used to be full of energy, full of light. Now, even when she tried to sound normal, it was heavy, like she was always carrying something too big for her to hold. Jalen hesitated in the doorway, unsure of how to bring it up. He wanted to tell her about the voice, about the warmth he had felt, about how for the first time in months it had seemed like his father was still there, watching over him. But as he watched his mother's shoulders slump with exhaustion, he suddenly felt selfish. She was already carrying so much. Would telling her make it worse? Instead, he just shrugged. I went to the cemetery. His mother turned fully now, setting the cutting board on the counter. Her expression softened, though her eyes flickered with something close to worry. "Oh, Jay," she murmured. She stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. "Are you okay?" Jalen nodded, but he didn't trust himself to speak. His mother studied him for a long moment, her lips pressed together like she was deciding whether to push for more. Finally, she just let out a breath and pulled him into a hug. She smelled like cinnamon and something else, something warm, something safe. "You don't have to go alone, baby," she whispered against his hair. Jalen didn't answer. He wasn't sure how to explain that he had needed to go alone, that if he hadn't, he might not have heard the voice at all. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he replayed the words over and over in his head. "You're braver than you think." He wanted to believe them. He really did. But he didn't feel brave. He felt lost. The next morning, school felt harder than usual. Jalen sat at his desk, staring down at his open notebook, but the words on the page blurred together. His teacher was talking about something, math, maybe science, but he wasn't paying attention. Ever since his father had died, school had started to feel like a place he didn't belong. Before, he had been part of things. He had laughed with his friends, joined in on games at recess, raised his hand in class when he knew the answer. But now, he felt separate, like there was a glass wall between him and everyone else. People still talked to him, but it was different. Their voices were softer, more careful, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. Sometimes, they didn't say anything at all. And then, there were the ones who weren't careful, the ones who whispered things when they thought he couldn't hear them. My dad says people like his dad always get in trouble. It's sad, but you know how it is. Mom says he's lucky they even let him come back to school so soon. Jalen didn't know why they thought he couldn't hear them. Maybe they thought grief made people deaf. Maybe they just didn't care. He clenched his fists under his desk, staring harder at the numbers in his notebook. The lump in his throat felt thick. He thought about the voice. "You're braver than you think." But what did that even mean? What was he supposed to do? At lunch, Jalen sat alone. He had gotten used to it. He used to sit with his best friend, Malik, but even Malik had started drifting away. It wasn't like they had fought. It was just different now. Jalen could feel the distance, and he didn't know how to close it. He was about to pull out his book and lose himself in it, like he did most days when he noticed a new kid sitting alone at the far end of the cafeteria. Jalen had seen him in class before, a boy with dark, wavy hair, and a nervous way of glancing around, like he was afraid of taking up too much space. No one was talking to him. No one had even sat at his table. Jalen hesitated. Before his father died, he wouldn't have thought twice about going over. He would have slid into the seat next to him, introduced himself, and asked if the kid wanted to play soccer after school. But that was before. Now, everything felt harder. He looked down at his tray, pushed his food around with his fork, then thought about what his father would say. Sometimes being brave means reaching out first. His stomach twisted. Maybe the kid didn't want company. Maybe he was fine being alone. Or maybe he wasn't. Jalen took a deep breath. Then, before he could change his mind, he picked up his tray and walked over. "Hey," he said, standing awkwardly at the edge of the table. "Can I sit here?" The boy looked up, surprised. For a second, he just blinked at Jalen like he couldn't believe he was talking to him. Then slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," he said, "sure." Jalen slid into the seat. "I'm Jalen," he said. The boy hesitated, then gave a small, shy smile. "I'm Alex." Jalen nodded, picking up his fork. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. Jalen didn't know if it was the voice he had heard at the cemetery, the warmth in the wind, or just the way his father's words had settled inside him. But something had shifted. It wasn't like the world suddenly became easier or that the weight on his chest had disappeared. The sadness was still there, thick and heavy. But there was something else now, too, a quiet determination, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be swallowed by the silence. Sitting with Alex at lunch had been the first step. It wasn't a grand gesture. He hadn't stood up in front of the school or done anything that people would call brave, but it had been something. And in the days that followed, he realized that even small things had power. Alex had started sitting with him regularly, and their conversation slowly grew from hesitant to comfortable. They talked about favorite foods, books, video games. Jalen found out that Alex had just moved from another state and didn't know anyone here. He found out that Alex's dad was in the military and was always away. He found out that Alex liked to draw, but was too nervous to show anyone his sketches. One afternoon, Jalen caught a glimpse of a drawing in Alex's notebook, an intricate pencil sketch of a wolf shaded so carefully that it looked like it might leap off the page. "That's amazing," Jalen said before he could stop himself. Alex's ears turned red. "It's not," he mumbled quickly, flipping the page. "It is," Jalen insisted. "You're really good." Alex hesitated, his fingers twitching over the notebook. "I don't really show people," he admitted. "I don't know. It's just easier that way." Jalen nodded, understanding more than he could say. After that, something unspoken formed between them. Neither of them talked about the things that weighed them down, not directly, but they both understood that the other carried something heavy. Maybe that was enough. But even though Jalen had found a friend in Alex, the rest of the world hadn't changed. The quiet judgment was still there, the whispers, the way some teachers looked at him differently now, like they were waiting for him to slip up, the way certain parents pulled their kids a little closer when they saw him. He had noticed it before, but now, after everything that had happened, he saw it even more clearly. One afternoon, he was walking home when he saw a group of older boys on the sidewalk up ahead. He recognized them from the neighborhood. They weren't much older than him, maybe 13 or 14, but they carried themselves like they were grown. Jalen wasn't afraid of them, but he knew better than to draw attention to himself. As he got closer, he heard their voices. "You see what happened over on Maple Street?" one of them was saying. "Another dude got arrested last night." "For what?" "Nothing. You know how it is." Jalen kept his head down, pretending not to listen, but the words dug into him. He knew exactly how it was. At home, his mother was sitting at the dining table looking through a pile of mail, her face tight,
her lips pressed together in that way that meant she was trying not to show how tired she was.
At lunch, Jalen sat alone. He had gotten used to it. He used to sit with his best friend, Malik, but even Malik had started drifting away. It wasn't like they had fought. It was just different now. Jalen could feel the distance, and he didn't know how to close it. He was about to pull out his book and lose himself in it, like he did most days when he noticed a new kid sitting alone at the far end of the cafeteria. Jalen had seen him in class before, a boy with dark, wavy hair, and a nervous way of glancing around, like he was afraid of taking up too much space. No one was talking to him. No one had even sat at his table. Jalen hesitated. Before his father died, he wouldn't have thought twice about going over. He would have slid into the seat next to him, introduced himself, and asked if the kid wanted to play soccer after school. But that was before. Now, everything felt harder. He looked down at his tray, pushed his food around with his fork, then thought about what his father would say. Sometimes being brave means reaching out first. His stomach twisted. Maybe the kid didn't want company. Maybe he was fine being alone. Or maybe he wasn't. Jalen took a deep breath. Then, before he could change his mind, he picked up his tray and walked over. "Hey," he said, standing awkwardly at the edge of the table. "Can I sit here?" The boy looked up, surprised. For a second, he just blinked at Jalen like he couldn't believe he was talking to him. Then slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," he said, "sure." Jalen slid into the seat. "I'm Jalen," he said. The boy hesitated, then gave a small, shy smile. "I'm Alex." Jalen nodded, picking up his fork. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. Jalen didn't know if it was the voice he had heard at the cemetery, the warmth in the wind, or just the way his father's words had settled inside him. But something had shifted. It wasn't like the world suddenly became easier or that the weight on his chest had disappeared. The sadness was still there, thick and heavy. But there was something else now, too, a quiet determination, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be swallowed by the silence. Sitting with Alex at lunch had been the first step. It wasn't a grand gesture. He hadn't stood up in front of the school or done anything that people would call brave, but it had been something. And in the days that followed, he realized that even small things had power. Alex had started sitting with him regularly, and their conversation slowly grew from hesitant to comfortable. They talked about favorite foods, books, video games. Jalen found out that Alex had just moved from another state and didn't know anyone here. He found out that Alex's dad was in the military and was always away. He found out that Alex liked to draw, but was too nervous to show anyone his sketches. One afternoon, Jalen caught a glimpse of a drawing in Alex's notebook, an intricate pencil sketch of a wolf shaded so carefully that it looked like it might leap off the page. "That's amazing," Jalen said before he could stop himself. Alex's ears turned red. "It's not," he mumbled quickly, flipping the page. "It is," Jalen insisted. "You're really good." Alex hesitated, his fingers twitching over the notebook. "I don't really show people," he admitted. "I don't know. It's just easier that way." Jalen nodded, understanding more than he could say. After that, something unspoken formed between them. Neither of them talked about the things that weighed them down, not directly, but they both understood that the other carried something heavy. Maybe that was enough. But even though Jalen had found a friend in Alex, the rest of the world hadn't changed. The quiet judgment was still there, the whispers, the way some teachers looked at him differently now, like they were waiting for him to slip up,
the way certain parents pulled their kids a little closer when they saw him. He had noticed it before, but now, after everything that had happened, he saw it even more clearly. One afternoon, he was walking home when he saw a group of older boys on the sidewalk up ahead. He recognized them from the neighborhood. They weren't much older than him, maybe 13 or 14, but they carried themselves like they were grown. Jalen wasn't afraid of them, but he knew better than to draw attention to himself. As he got closer, he heard their voices. "You see what happened over on Maple Street?" One of them was saying. "Another dude got arrested last night." "For what?" "Nothing. You know how it is." Jalen kept his head down, pretending not to listen, but the words dug into him. He knew exactly how it was. At home, his mother was sitting at the dining table looking through a pile of mail, her face tight, her lips pressed together in that way that meant she was trying not to show how tired she was.
Jalen hesitated in the doorway, watching her. She hadn't been the same since his father died. She still did all the things she used to. Went to work, cooked dinner, helped him with homework. But there was something missing now, like a part of her had disappeared along with his dad. He sat down across from her. Mom looked up. Her eyes softened when she saw him. "What is it, baby?" she asked. Jalen swallowed. He wasn't sure how to say it. "Why do people treat us different?" His mother stilled. Her fingers tightened around an envelope. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she set the mail aside and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Who said something to you?" Jalen shook his head. "Nobody. Not really. It's just, I see it. I hear it." He hesitated, then admitted, "Even at school, the teachers, the other kids, it's like they look at me different now." His mother let out a slow breath, her gaze heavy with something Jalen couldn't quite name. "You're not imagining it," she said finally. "This world doesn't always treat us the way we deserve to be treated. Your father and I, we always knew we'd have to prepare you for that. We just thought we'd have more time." Jalen looked down at the table, his fingers tracing patterns against the wood. "It's not fair." "No," his mother agreed. "It's not." He thought about the voice he had heard at the cemetery, the way it had wrapped around him like warmth. He thought about what his father would have said. "What am I supposed to do?" Jalen whispered. His mother reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You stand tall," she said. "You don't let them decide who you are. And when you see someone else going through it, you don't look away. You stand with them." Jalen nodded, but he still didn't know what that meant. Not really. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about everything his mother had said, about everything his father had told him, about what it meant to be brave. The next day at school, something happened that made it all clearer. Jalen was walking down the hall when he saw another boy, James, a kid from his class, standing against a row of lockers. His back was pressed to the metal, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack so tightly that his knuckles were white. In front of him were two other boys, older, taller. "Why do you talk like that?" one of them sneered. James didn't answer. He was new, and he had a slight accent. Jalen had overheard him saying that his family had just moved from Nigeria. "Hey, we asked you a question," the other boy said, stepping closer. James shrank back, looking down at the floor. Jalen's chest tightened. He could have walked away. No one was looking at him. No one expected him to say anything. But he thought about his mother's words. When you see someone else going through it, you don't look away. Jalen stepped forward before he could talk himself out of it. "Leave him alone," he said, his voice steady. The two older boys turned. "What?" "You heard me," Jalen said. His hands were shaking, but he clenched them into fists at his sides. "Just leave him alone." The boys stared at him for a moment, then exchanged glances. One of them rolled his eyes. "Whatever," he muttered, nudging his friend. "Let's go." Jalen didn't move until they were gone. Then he turned to James. "You okay?" James hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. Jalen nodded back. "Cool. Want to sit with me at lunch?" James blinked like he hadn't expected that. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Yeah, okay." As Jalen walked down the hall, his heart was still racing. His palms were sweaty. His stomach was twisted up in knots. But somewhere deep inside, something else was there too. Something that felt a little bit like courage. Jalen stood at the cemetery again, but this time he wasn't alone. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of autumn morning that made the world feel sharper, clearer. The sky stretched wide above him, a dull gray with thick clouds that threatened rain but never quite followed through. The ground beneath his feet was damp from the night before, the scent of wet earth filling the air. His fingers curled around the stem of a single white flower, the same kind he had left here months ago. Beside him, his mother stood, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her expression unreadable. Behind them, scattered in small groups, stood the kids from his school. Alex was there, hands jammed into his hoodie, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he was nervous. James stood quietly, a few steps back, his eyes flickering over the rows of gravestones, his lips pressed together. Even Malik was there, the friend Jalen had once thought he might lose, standing with his arms crossed, his usual smirk absent. They had come for different reasons. Some of them had lost people like he had. Some of them just wanted to support him. But they were all here. Jalen took a deep breath and let his gaze fall back to the gravestone. It didn't feel the same as the first time he had come here. He wasn't trembling. His chest wasn't clenched so tight that it hurt to breathe. The sadness was still there. He knew it always would be, but it had changed shape. It wasn't the same heavy, suffocating thing it had been before. It was quieter now, settled into him like something permanent, but no longer unbearable. He knelt down and placed the flower at the base of the gravestone. His fingers hovered there for a moment, tracing the edges of the carved letters. "Hi, Dad," he said softly. His voice didn't shake. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, the wind rustling through the trees. He thought about the first time he had come here, how lost he had felt, how desperate he had been for something, anything, to make him feel like his father wasn't really gone. He thought about the voice he had heard, the warmth he had felt in the wind. He had wondered for weeks after if it had been real, or just his mind clinging to something it couldn't let go of. But now, he thought, maybe it didn't matter. Maybe what mattered wasn't whether his father had truly spoken to him that day. Maybe what mattered was that his father's voice was still inside him, guiding him, pushing him forward, helping him stand, even when everything felt too heavy. "It's been a year," Jalen said, his fingers tightening slightly against the stone. "And I've been thinking a lot about you." He hesitated, then glanced up at his mother. She gave him a small nod, her eyes glistening with something he didn't quite have words for. "I've tried to be brave," Jalen continued, "just like you said." He let out a breath. "I started something, a group at school, for kids like me, like us, kids who've lost people, kids who feel like they don't belong." His voice softened. "I think you'd be proud of us." The wind stirred slightly, rushing against his cheek. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the feeling settle deep inside him. "I miss you every day," he whispered, "but I know you're still here. I feel you in the wind, in the stars, in me." He let his hand fall away from the stone and slowly pushed himself back to his feet. He turned to face the group behind him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, his mother reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "You did good, baby," she murmured. He nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. The group lingered for a while after that, talking in quiet voices, sharing stories. Some of them had never been to a cemetery before. Some of them had too many times, but none of them were alone. As they walked away, Jalen felt lighter than he had in a long time. Later that evening, he sat on the porch, watching the sky shift from gray to deep blue as the first stars began to peek through. He pulled his father's jacket tighter around him, the fabric worn but familiar. He thought about everything that had happened in the past year, the grief, the anger, the loneliness, the way the world had changed, and the way it had stayed the same. He thought about his father's voice, the way it still echoed in his mind, steady and warm. "You're braver than you think." Jalen didn't feel fearless. He didn't think he ever would. But he had learned something in the past year. Bravery wasn't about never being scared. It was about moving forward anyway. He looked up at the sky, at the stars, at the vastness of it all. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more like it. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories. And if this one resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it.